There are moments in a profession when the tools change. And then there are moments when the economics of judgment change. This course is about the second. Artificial intelligence has lowered the cost of producing structured language. Drafts are faster, summaries are cleaner, comparisons are immediate. Documentation can be generated at a speed that would have been difficult to imagine only a few years ago. But when production becomes inexpensive, something else becomes scarce. Discernment. Internal audit has always carried a mandate that is both technical and moral. Independent assurance, calibrated risk interpretation, defensible conclusions, early identification of exposure before it compounds. AI does not eliminate that mandate. It exposes it. When execution accelerates, judgment becomes visible. When documentation is uniformly polished, differentiation moves upstream to selection, framing, severity calibration, escalation timing, and ownership. This course is not about how to use AI. It is about how to govern it. It is about how to think clearly when answers arrive quickly. It is about how to preserve skepticism when fluency feels persuasive. It is about how to maintain proportionality when tone can be generated instantly. And it is about how to lead under compression when speed, risk, and ambiguity collide. We will examine the structural shift created by AI. We will explore where value now concentrates. We will audit our own roles, our workflows, and our prompting habits. We will identify failure patterns that erode discipline quietly, and we will define what good integration actually looks like, operationally, culturally, and behaviorally. This is not a technology course. It is a judgment course delivered in a technological moment. The professionals who thrive in this environment will not be those who generate the most output. They will be those who decide well. They will understand that execution accelerates, but consequence does not diminish. They will know where friction must be reintroduced intentionally. They will protect verification boundaries. They will own conclusions clearly. And they will recognize that AI, properly governed, is not a shortcut around judgment, but an amplifier of it. If you approach this course looking for prompt tricks, you will find structure. If you approach it looking for leverage, you will find discipline. Because in an AI-accelerated world, clarity is common, calibration is rare. And internal audit's influence will depend on which one it chooses to cultivate. Section 1. Thinking AI first. If effort is no longer visible in the output, what becomes visible instead? For decades, professional credibility was built on visible labor. The thickness of binders suggested diligence. The density of documentation suggested thoroughness. The length of meetings suggested seriousness. Execution was expensive in time and energy, and because it was expensive, it signaled commitment and competence. AI changes the economics of that signal. When summaries can be produced instantly, when draft narratives are coherent on first pass, when testing documentation can be structured in seconds, the artifact no longer reveals the effort behind it. Production becomes inexpensive. And when production becomes inexpensive, it stops signaling quality. This is not a subtle shift. It is structural. Internal audit has historically been evaluated on evidence of work performed. Was the scope completed? Were procedures documented? Were conclusions supported? These remain foundational expectations. But as AI lowers the cost of generating documentation, the baseline rises. Clean artifacts are assumed. Structured output is expected. Coherent language is no longer differentiating. If everyone can produce polished work papers quickly, what does the polish prove? When producing artifacts becomes easy, what remains difficult? Selection remains difficult. Determining which risks deserve examination remains difficult. Distinguishing between noise and signal remains difficult. Calibrating severity remains difficult. Escalating at the right moment remains difficult. Saying no remains difficult. AI does not eliminate these constraints. It makes them more visible. If generating options is easy, what becomes scarce? Abundance shifts scarcity. When information multiplies, attention becomes constrained. When scenarios expand, discernment becomes constrained. When drafting accelerates, prioritization becomes constrained. Scarcity migrates from execution to judgment. This migration alters where value concentrates. When execution was the bottleneck, productivity signaled value. When judgment becomes the bottleneck, discernment signals value. The professional who can identify which questions matter before analysis begins becomes more valuable than the one who drafts the fastest. But this shift can be uncomfortable. The instinct under technological acceleration is to increase output. More coverage, more summaries, more documentation, more automation. It feels responsible. It feels modern. It feels aligned with efficiency. But when execution is nearly free, what does producing more actually signal? If everything gets done, what was chosen? Choice defines leverage. Choice reveals priorities. Choice exposes trade-offs. If speed increases but influence does not, something fundamental has shifted. Activity can expand without impact expanding. If decision quality becomes the real measure of value, how visible is it in your current work? Judgment rarely leaves an artifact labeled judgment. It is embedded in what was excluded from scope. It is reflected in the framing of a risk hypothesis. It is evident in the calibration of language. It is visible in the timing of escalation. In an AI-enabled environment, these inflection points become more consequential because surrounding processes move faster. When acceleration increases, directional errors compound more quickly. Thinking AI first does not mean defaulting to AI. It means recognizing where the constraint now resides. The constraint is no longer drafting. The constraint is deciding. That recognition reframes the role of internal audit. AI lowers the cost of producing audit artifacts, summaries, drafts, testing documentation, issue narratives. When production becomes inexpensive, it stops signaling quality. As execution accelerates, judgment becomes exposed. Internal audit will not be evaluated primarily on how much was produced. It will be evaluated on whether the right risks were examined early enough to matter. This is the economic shift. It is subtle in language, but profound in implication. Historically, the burden of proof was completeness. Demonstrate that work was performed. Demonstrate that coverage was adequate. Demonstrate that procedures were followed. Increasingly, the burden becomes discernment. Demonstrate that risk selection was sound. Demonstrate that severity calibration reflects context. Demonstrate that escalation timing reflects consequence. Execution remains necessary. It is no longer sufficient. AI also alters expectations outside the audit function. Management now operates with similar tools. Analyses arrive pre-packaged. Explanations are structured. Narratives are plausible. Issues may be accompanied by their own risk assessments. Under these conditions, internal audit's role shifts subtly from producing clarity to determining whether clarity is earned or illusory. That is a higher bar. Fluency can mimic rigor. Coherence can resemble sufficiency. Confidence can feel like correctness. But coherence is not evidence. Completeness is not sufficiency. Confidence is not correctness. These distinctions become harder to detect when output quality is high by default. Have you ever felt reassured because something sounded right? That moment is the inflection point. Sounding right is not the same as being supported. Structured language can conceal fragile premises. A well-organized narrative can smooth over untested assumptions. Balanced phrasing can obscure asymmetry in risk exposure. Thinking I first requires disciplined skepticism toward fluency. It requires asking, what is the underlying evidence? What assumptions are embedded in this framing? What has not been said? If effort is no longer visible in the output, what becomes visible instead? Intent becomes visible. Boundaries become visible. Inspection becomes visible. The professional who declares what kind of thinking is required signals maturity. The professional who names what is not being decided signals control. The professional who surfaces uncertainty signals integrity. In contrast, the professional who relies solely on output polish signals dependency. The shift is not about abandoning execution. It is about re-weighting its role. Execution accelerates, judgment concentrates. When information is abundant, what becomes rare? Clarity of priority becomes rare. Willingness to narrow becomes rare. Comfort with leaving some analysis unperformed becomes rare. In an AI-enabled environment, it is possible to analyze endlessly. It is possible to generate scenario after scenario. It is possible to expand documentation beyond practical usefulness. But without narrowing, clarity dissolves. When insight scales faster than attention, attention becomes the bottleneck. Internal audit must therefore protect its attention deliberately. This begins with explicit recognition. Not every available analysis deserves equal weight. Not every plausible scenario requires escalation. Not every structured narrative reflects sufficient evidence. Scarcity is no longer time to draft. Scarcity is disciplined focus. And disciplined focus requires conscious trade-offs. Trade-offs are uncomfortable because they reveal what is not being pursued. They reveal what is being deprioritized. They expose risk tolerance. AI does not eliminate trade-offs. It can obscure them. If trade-offs are unnamed, they still exist. They are simply implicit. Implicit trade-offs are dangerous because they cannot be examined. Thinking AI first means making trade-offs explicit. If a risk area is excluded from scope, why? If an issue is classified as moderate rather than significant, based on what criteria? If a narrative is softened to preserve tone, what exposure is being accepted? These questions are not philosophical. They are operational. They determine where judgment resides. As execution becomes easier, the temptation to equate productivity with value intensifies. The volume of artifacts can expand dramatically without improving risk posture. The differentiator becomes disciplined selectivity. Disciplined selectivity is not about doing less. It is about doing what matters most. In practice, this means engaging earlier in planning conversations to influence scope before it hardens. Interrogating assumptions embedded in management's AI-assisted analyses. Separating exploration from commitment so that plausible narratives do not prematurely close options. Documenting reasoning clearly so that conclusions can be reconstructed under scrutiny. Protecting verification boundaries so that AI-generated content does not become evidentiary by default. These behaviors signal judgment. Judgment is harder to automate because it is contextual. It depends on organizational history, regulatory posture, stakeholder expectations, and risk appetite. AI can summarize past findings. It cannot intuit current board sensitivity. It can compare severity classifications across industries. It cannot feel reputational fragility. Thinking I first, therefore, means understanding AI's strengths and limits without exaggerating either. AI excels at structuring information, generating alternatives, and organizing comparisons. It is weaker at weighting consequences in alignment with specific accountability structures. The moment you accept AI output without reweighting it through your own accountability lens, judgment shifts subtly. Responsibility does not shift with it. This is the exposure. As execution becomes inexpensive, errors of judgment become more visible. Under acceleration, miscalibrated severity can propagate faster. Misframed risk can anchor discussions prematurely. Misplaced confidence can influence committee perception. The cost of incorrect judgment does not decrease simply because drafting cost decreases. In fact, it may increase because decisions are made faster. If more can be done in less time, the velocity of consequence increases. Therefore, discernment must intensify proportionally. The central insight of this section is simple but consequential. AI reduces the cost of producing work. It does not reduce the cost of being wrong. If anything, it compresses the timeline in which wrongness is revealed. In that environment, value concentrates around those who can distinguish plausible from supported, coherent from sufficient, confident from correct. This is not an abstract ideal. It is a professional imperative. The future of internal audit will not be defined by how comprehensively it uses AI. It will be defined by how deliberately it governs its use. Thinking AI first is not about enthusiasm. It is about clarity. It is about recognizing that the signal has changed. Effort is no longer visible in the artifact. Judgment is. And judgment, once exposed, must be cultivated intentionally. The sections that follow build on this premise. They examine where value concentrates when execution converges. They interrogate role, skill, and influence under acceleration. They explore how workflow becomes a strategic control over thinking. They identify where AI breaks and how judgment catches it. They articulate prompting as a professional discipline rather than a technical trick. But everything begins here. Execution accelerates, judgment concentrates. The constraint has moved, and where constraint moves, so does leverage. Section 2. Where value concentrates. If speed, volume, and polish are easy to replicate, what actually differentiates professionals? In an AI-enabled environment, visible execution converges. Reports look similar. Narratives are structured. Risk descriptions are coherent. Even tone begins to standardize because language models tend toward balance and clarity. When visible execution converges, separation moves upstream. It moves to framing. It moves to prioritization. It moves to the ability to define what matters before the analysis begins. Historically, differentiation in internal audit often showed up in thoroughness. One team documented more comprehensively. Another produced clearer summaries. Another responded faster to management requests. Those distinctions narrow when drafting accelerates. When speed and polish become baseline expectations, differentiation concentrates around judgment. Judgment is visible in what was chosen to examine, not just how it was documented. It is visible in the sequencing of work. What was examined first and what was deferred. It is visible in the calibration of severity, how exposure is interpreted in context. It is visible in the courage to elevate a concern before consensus forms. Execution scales horizontally. Judgment scales vertically. Execution can be multiplied across staff levels. Judgment compounds through experience and disciplined thinking. Execution can be copied. Judgment accumulates. In a world where documentation quality is high by default, leaders begin to look for different signals. They look for fewer surprises. They look for earlier identification of material risk. They look for calibrated escalation rather than reactive reporting. They look for independence that remains intact under pressure. If execution is abundant, which kind of work scales faster? Comfort-producing work scales easily. Comfort-producing work organizes existing information. It summarizes. It restates. It aligns. It reassures. Leverage-producing work scales differently. Leverage-producing work introduces friction. It asks uncomfortable questions. It narrows options. It surfaces trade-offs that others prefer to smooth over. Comfort reduces anxiety. Leverage reduces exposure. When leaders value fewer surprises more than thicker binders, leverage-producing work compounds over time. Consider the difference between two audit engagements. In one, the team documents control deficiencies precisely and clearly. Findings are well written. Evidence is organized. Reporting is timely. In another, the team identifies a risk trajectory early, before control breakdown becomes visible. They challenge assumptions in management's risk assessment. They escalate timing concerns before exposure materializes. Both teams may produce strong documentation. Only one changes direction. When your involvement changes a decision, what artifact is left behind? Often, none. The most consequential audit contributions do not always appear as additional pages in a report. They appear as altered paths, a risk that is mitigated earlier, a classification that is calibrated differently, a scope that is expanded before a blind spot becomes public, a narrative that is adjusted before reaching the committee. These are inflection points. AI accelerates surrounding processes. Inflection points therefore compound more quickly. If early framing determines outcomes, where in the process are you consistently involved? This question is central to professional positioning. There is a meaningful difference between participating after direction is set and participating before commitment is formed. If your contribution begins after scope is finalized, you are optimizing execution. If your contribution begins during risk framing, you are influencing exposure. Access to early framing is not granted by default. It is earned through demonstrated discernment. Discernment is demonstrated through consistent calibration, not through volume of output. If access expands when judgment compounds, what moments are you creating repeatedly? Are you consistently invited into planning conversations? Are your perspectives sought when classification decisions are being weighed? Are you included when severity thresholds are debated? Or are you primarily engaged when documentation must be completed? In an AI-accelerated environment, management will arrive with analysis already structured. Issues may come prepackaged with plausible explanations. Risk narratives may be coherent before audit enters the discussion. Under those conditions, internal audit's role evolves from produce clarity to determine whether clarity is earned or illusory. This distinction increases scrutiny. AI does not diffuse accountability, it concentrates it. When management can produce structured analyses quickly, audit's differentiation is no longer drafting speed. It is the ability to interrogate assumptions embedded in that analysis. Fluency can mimic rigor. A well-written explanation can feel complete. A balanced argument can feel sufficient. A confident presentation can feel correct. But coherence is not evidence. Completeness is not sufficiency. Confidence is not correctness. These distinctions are easy to articulate and difficult to enforce under acceleration. If visible execution converges, where does separation occur? Separation occurs in the willingness to name uncertainty explicitly, the discipline to separate exploration from commitment, the ability to identify asymmetry in risk exposure, the courage to escalate when narratives feel prematurely settled. It also occurs in language. Language signals ownership. The analysis suggests, subtly shifts authority outward. Based on the evidence reviewed, we conclude signals accountability. When authority is attributed outward, responsibility contracts only rhetorically. It does not contract legally or professionally. If your work looks similar to everyone else's, what signal are you actually sending? In a landscape of high-quality artifacts, sameness signals compliance, not differentiation. Differentiation emerges from disciplined selectivity. Disciplined selectivity requires trade-offs. Not every potential risk deserves equal attention. Not every anomaly warrants escalation. Not every plausible scenario requires expansion of scope. But these decisions must be reasoned, not implicit. Implicit trade-offs are invisible and therefore unexaminable. Explicit trade-offs demonstrate maturity. If execution is abundant, which contribution compounds over time? The contribution that compounds is the one that alters direction. Over time, leaders remember who identified risk early. They remember who calibrated severity appropriately. They remember who preserved independence when consensus leaned elsewhere. They rarely remember who drafted the fastest. The compounding effect of judgment is subtle but durable. One accurate early escalation builds credibility. Two disciplined severity calibrations build trust. Three well-timed interventions build influence. Influence expands access. Access expands early involvement. Early involvement expands leverage. This is how value concentrates. AI acceleration makes these patterns more visible. When documentation is uniformly strong, leaders look for something else. They look for discernment. They look for calibrated skepticism. They look for the professional who can say, "This looks coherent, but here is what may be missing." In that environment, internal audit must be deliberate about positioning. It must resist the temptation to compete on volume. It must focus on shaping trajectory rather than perfecting artifacts. The economic shift created by AI lowers the cost of producing audit artifacts. It raises the premium on discernment. Internal audit is no longer evaluated primarily on how much was produced. It is evaluated on whether the right risks were examined early enough to matter. This reframing changes incentives internally as well. If teams are rewarded solely on throughput, they will optimize throughput. If teams are evaluated on influence, they will prioritize framing. Leadership within internal audit must therefore align evaluation metrics with the new constraint. If the constraint is judgment, incentives must reflect judgment. If execution becomes baseline, differentiation must be cultivated intentionally. The shift is not about diminishing the importance of execution. Execution remains foundational. Evidence must be gathered. Testing must be performed. Documentation must be defensible. But foundational does not mean differentiating. As AI becomes embedded in workflows, the baseline rises. Clean, structured, timely documentation becomes expected. Differentiation becomes rarer. And rarity defines value. When capability becomes widespread, the scarce behavior commands attention. In this environment, scarce behaviors include naming uncomfortable truths early, calibrating severity independent of external pressure, challenging plausible but incomplete narratives, holding the line when momentum builds toward premature closure, protecting verification boundaries even when acceleration tempts shortcuts. These behaviors require confidence grounded in reasoning. They require clarity about mandate. They require a willingness to accept short-term discomfort for long-term credibility. Value concentrates where courage and discernment intersect. That is not rhetorical. It is structural. AI reduces friction in drafting. It does not reduce friction in confrontation. It does not reduce friction in escalation. It does not reduce friction in accountability. In fact, by accelerating output, it can increase the pace at which these confrontations must occur. When speed increases, hesitation feels riskier. When hesitation feels riskier, premature closure becomes more tempting. This is where disciplined framing becomes essential. Framing determines what is examined and what is assumed. If framing is influenced too heavily by I-generated narratives, independence narrows. If framing remains anchored in mandate and risk appetite, independence remains intact. Where value concentrates, scrutiny increases. As internal audit differentiates itself through judgment rather than volume, its conclusions will be examined more closely. This is not a disadvantage. It is a sign that leverage has shifted. If leaders expect more from judgment, they will test it more rigorously. Disciplined reasoning must therefore be inspectable. Inspectable reasoning means documenting assumptions, naming trade-offs, clarifying evidence thresholds, explaining classification logic. AI can assist articulation. It cannot substitute for reasoning. The professionals who thrive in this environment will not be those who master every prompt pattern. They will be those who consistently apply discernment before and after AI assistance. They will be those who understand that execution is accelerated, but consequence is not reduced. They will be those who recognize that visible output no longer signals effort, and therefore effort must shift toward what remains scarce. What remains scarce is disciplined judgment applied early enough to alter exposure. That is where value concentrates. Section 3. Role, skill, and judgment audit. But when capabilities become easier to copy, what does adding another tool actually change? For most of your career, professional growth likely meant accumulation. New certifications, new systems, new methodologies, new technical proficiencies, mastery signaled advancement. The professional who knew more could do more. And the professional who could do more was more valuable. That logic weakens when capability becomes widely accessible. When AI can structure analysis, summarize testing results, generate draft findings, and compare regulatory language in seconds, technical fluency alone no longer differentiates at the same level. If many professionals can approximate your output using the same tools, where does long-term advantage actually live? It lives in positioning. It lives in timing. It lives in influence over decisions. Skills are inputs. Outcomes diverge at the decision point. Internal audit has always contained two layers of contribution. The visible layer is execution, testing controls, gathering evidence, drafting work papers, articulating findings. The less visible layer is judgment, selecting which risks to prioritize, calibrating severity, determining when to escalate, framing narratives before they harden. AI compresses the visible layer. It does not compress the invisible one. This forces a role recalibration. If your work stopped tomorrow, would decisions change? Or would execution simply slow down? This is not a rhetorical question. It is diagnostic. If your absence results in delayed documentation, your contribution is primarily executional. If your absence alters how risks are interpreted, how issues are classified, or when matters are escalated, your contribution is judgmental. At what point does your thinking enter the process? Before commitment or after? There is a structural difference between participating in audit planning and refining documentation after scope has been finalized. There is a difference between shaping risk hypotheses and validating control design. There is a difference between influencing issue severity before it reaches leadership and editing language for tone the night before reporting. AI accelerates execution. It does not automatically expand your access to early framing. Access to early framing is earned. It is earned through consistent calibration. It is earned through disciplined reasoning. It is earned through demonstrating that your involvement reduces exposure rather than simply increasing documentation quality. If execution becomes cheaper, effort becomes a weaker signal of value. You can work longer hours than ever before. You can produce more structured documentation than ever before. You can respond faster than ever before. But if those efforts do not shift decisions, their strategic value narrows. Effort is visible, influence is delayed. Effort can be counted in hours and artifacts. Influence must be inferred from directional change. Can you trace how decisions shifted because you were involved? Trace specific moments. A risk area included in scope that might otherwise have been excluded. A classification adjusted because contextual exposure was underweighted. A finding reframed to reflect systemic weakness rather than isolated failure. An escalation that occurred earlier because timing risk was identified. These are inflection points. AI makes inflection points more consequential because surrounding processes move faster. When acceleration increases, small directional shifts compound more quickly. This is why role clarity becomes critical. If your thinking consistently enters after commitment, your leverage is narrow. If it enters before commitment, your leverage expands. This is not a hierarchical question. It is a structural one. Hierarchy can provide authority, but it does not guarantee influence. Influence is demonstrated through calibrated judgment. Skill development must therefore evolve. Technical fluency remains necessary. Understanding how AI tools function, how to structure prompts effectively, how to interpret outputs responsibly, these are foundational competencies. But they are not sufficient for differentiation. The differentiator becomes the ability to identify asymmetry in risk, recognize when coherence masks fragility, detect when speed is replacing scrutiny, hold classification standards under pressure, articulate trade-offs clearly and defensibly. These are judgment skills. Judgment skills are contextual. They depend on mandate, regulatory posture, risk appetite, organizational history, and stakeholder expectations. AI can assist in surfacing alternatives. It cannot weight them according to your accountability. If your risk tolerance is unspoken, AI defaults to neutrality. Neutrality may not align with your mandate. If your escalation threshold is implicit, AI-generated narratives may drift toward moderation. If your severity criteria are not explicitly applied, AI-drafted findings may unconsciously soften language. This is how silent drift occurs. It is not malicious, it is mechanical. Judgment must therefore be applied consciously at each stage. Another dimension of the audit is the distinction between skill depth and skill visibility. Skill depth includes contextual reasoning, calibrated skepticism, and disciplined prioritization. Skill visibility includes presentation polish and structured articulation. AI increases skill visibility across the board. It does not automatically increase skill depth. When skill visibility rises uniformly, differentiation depends on depth. Depth is revealed in questions asked early. It is revealed in resistance applied under pressure. It is revealed in consistency across engagements. Consistency compounds credibility. Credibility expands access. Access expands leverage. This is the compounding loop. If you consistently demonstrate that your involvement reduces exposure and improves calibration, leadership will involve you earlier. Earlier involvement allows you to shape framing. Framing determines outcome trajectory. Trajectory determines exposure. This is how role evolves from executor to influencer. The shift is subtle but powerful. It requires moving from "how do I complete this engagement efficiently" to "at what point in this life cycle does my judgment matter most?" It requires asking, if I were not in this conversation, what risk might go underweighted? It requires recognizing that AI acceleration compresses time for reflection. When time compresses, hesitation feels risky. When hesitation feels risky, premature closure becomes tempting. The professional who can introduce disciplined friction without appearing obstructive becomes invaluable. That professional is not necessarily the most technically fluent. They are the most calibrated. Calibration is not about conservatism. It is about proportionality. It is about aligning classification, escalation, and narrative with documented criteria and contextual risk appetite. AI can suggest categories. It cannot feel reputational sensitivity. It can draft language. It cannot own consequence. Ownership is human. Therefore, role evolution under AI requires explicit acceptance of that ownership. It requires the ability to state clearly, this classification reflects our criteria and contextual exposure. We are escalating now because timing risk outweighs informational completeness. This narrative accurately reflects evidence strength without overstating certainty. If those statements cannot be made confidently, the decision is not ready. The role and judgment audit therefore includes 3 dimensions. Placement. Where does your thinking enter the life cycle? Calibration. How consistently do you align conclusions with documented standards? Influence. Do your contributions alter trajectory or simply document it? These dimensions become more visible under AI acceleration. Because execution is faster, gaps in judgment are revealed sooner. Because documentation quality is uniformly high, differences in reasoning stand out more clearly. Because stakeholders assume acceleration, tolerance for ambiguity decreases. If your work stopped tomorrow, what would change? If the answer is documentation would slow, your role is executional. If the answer is risk interpretation would change, your role is judgmental. The goal is not to eliminate execution from your role. The goal is to ensure that execution supports judgment rather than substitutes for it. AI tempts substitution. It tempts you to believe that structured output equals structured thinking. It tempts you to believe that speed equals competence. It tempts you to equate polish with sufficiency. Resisting those temptations is part of the role shift. Role clarity under AI is not about rejecting tools. It is about understanding where your accountability remains unchanged. AI reduces drafting cost. It does not reduce professional liability. It does not reduce regulatory scrutiny. It does not reduce reputational consequence. In fact, by accelerating cycles, it may increase scrutiny because decisions are expected sooner. If you are going to be evaluated on judgment rather than volume, your development focus must shift accordingly. Study severity criteria deeply. Understand escalation thresholds thoroughly. Internalize regulatory posture. Know where independence has been tested historically. Develop the ability to articulate trade-offs without defensiveness. These are not features of a tool. They are attributes of a professional. And under acceleration, they become more visible. Execution accelerates. Judgment concentrates. Your role evolves accordingly. Section 4. Working with AI as a thinking partner. When answers arrive quickly, what friction disappears? For most of professional history, friction was built into thinking. Drafting required time. Analysis required sequencing. Silence in a meeting created tension that sometimes forced deeper questioning. The physical effort of producing work slowed the rate at which conclusions formed. AI removes much of that friction. Questions can be answered instantly. Comparisons can be structured immediately. Counter-arguments can be generated on demand. The delay between inquiry and articulation shrinks dramatically. When friction disappears, something else disappears with it. Space for doubt. Historically, delay often functioned as an unintentional control. The time required to draft allowed second thoughts. The effort required to structure analysis forced prioritization. The inconvenience of revising language created a natural checkpoint. When output becomes effortless, that checkpoint must be intentional. If resistance once created space for skepticism, what replaces it when output is immediate? Nothing replaces it automatically. That is the risk. Working with AI as a thinking partner requires deliberate reintroduction of friction, not obstruction, not delay for its own sake, but structured pause. When you accept a response without pressure testing it, something subtle shifts. It is not simply that the quality of thinking may decline. It is that ownership becomes less visible. AI can generate structure, surface alternatives, and articulate trade-offs. It cannot assume accountability. When conclusions are adopted without interrogation, authority drifts rhetorically, even if legal responsibility does not. This drift often appears in language. The model suggests. The analysis indicates. AI recommends. These phrases are technically accurate. They are also distancing. If consequences remain human, language must reflect that reality. Working with AI as a thinking partner requires clarity about what role it is playing in any given moment. Is it expanding possibility? Is it structuring comparison? Is it challenging assumptions, or is it drafting language after judgment has already occurred? Confusion among these roles creates silent control failures in thinking. If an idea appears plausible, how quickly does it become action? AI is exceptionally good at producing plausible narratives. It synthesizes patterns across data. It structures reasoning in a way that feels coherent and balanced. It fills gaps with statistically common transitions. Plausibility is not sufficiency. Disciplined difficulty improves decisions. Difficulty forces clarification. Difficulty reveals assumptions. Difficulty surfaces trade-offs. When AI generates alternatives, those alternatives can serve one of two purposes. They can expand thinking, or they can accelerate closure. The difference depends on posture. If alternatives are treated as exploratory inputs, subject to interrogation, they expand thinking. If they are treated as ready-made options, subject to selection, they accelerate closure. The speed of generation can trick the mind into believing that the underlying reasoning is equally robust. It is not. It is structured prediction. Working with AI effectively, therefore, requires explicit declarations of intent. Before engaging the system, the professional must clarify. What kind of thinking is required here? If the task is execution, structuring language after classification has been determined, AI is appropriately applied. If the task is decision support, comparing options before commitment, AI must structure implications without selecting. If the task is judgment, pressure testing assumptions under high stakes, AI must be adversarial rather than affirmative. Without clarity of intent, AI defaults to answering. Answering is not always the correct mode. Boundaries must also be explicit. If your risk tolerance is unspoken, AI will assume generic neutrality. If your escalation threshold is not declared, AI will calibrate language toward balance. If your severity criteria are not referenced, AI will draft narratives that may unconsciously soften exposure. Boundaries define what is not being decided. For example, we are not reassessing severity, only drafting language. We are exploring implications. No recommendation is being made. We are stress testing assumptions. No alternative is required. When boundaries are implicit, the system fills gaps. Those gaps are where assurance erodes. Inspection rules are equally critical. How should uncertainty be surfaced? Should weak evidence be highlighted? Should counter-arguments be prioritized? Should confidence levels be ranked? If inspection rules are not specified, output optimizes for coherence. Coherence can conceal fragility. Working with AI as a thinking partner also requires adversarial application at the right moments. Simulated disagreement becomes possible. AI can act as a skeptical regulator, a dissenting stakeholder, a hostile reviewer. When disagreement is simulated deliberately, patterns emerge. Objections cluster around specific assumptions. Narratives strain at particular points. Uniform agreement, by contrast, can conceal risk. If every generated perspective aligns comfortably, something may be missing. Perspective rotation is powerful when used intentionally. Running the same issue through different lenses, regulatory, operational, reputational, strategic, reveals asymmetry. But synthesis must remain human. AI can surface viewpoints. It cannot weight them in alignment with your mandate. Mandate alignment is not statistical. It is contextual. For internal audit, independence is not optional. Skepticism is not performative. Calibration is not aesthetic. AI can support articulation of skepticism. It cannot feel institutional history. Consider severity classification. A. I can compare your issue description against regulatory standards. It can generate precedent examples. It can draft language aligned with typical moderate or significant findings. But only you understand the board's current sensitivity to certain risk categories. Only you understand recent external scrutiny. Only you understand how prior findings were received. If those contextual elements are not incorporated consciously, AI output will default to pattern norms. Pattern norms may be misaligned with current exposure. Working with AI as a thinking partner therefore requires continual contextual overlay. Overlay means asking, does this reflect our documented criteria? Does this align with our risk appetite? Would I defend this framing to a regulator? Would I defend this severity in a public forum? If the answer is uncertain, the judgment phase is incomplete. Another dimension of partnership is selectivity. If AI accelerates analysis, does it accelerate trust? Not automatically. Trust depends on transparency of reasoning and clarity of ownership. If AI is used selectively, with declared intent, explicit boundaries, and documented inspection, credibility strengthens. If AI is used indiscriminately, blurring execution and judgment, credibility erodes. Stakeholders may not object to AI usage. They will object to conclusions that cannot be defended independently of it. Verification boundaries are therefore non-negotiable. AI-generated summaries must be traced to evidence. AI-drafted narratives must be reviewed for tonal drift. AI-suggested classifications must be weighed against documented standards. Working with AI as a thinking partner does not mean surrendering friction. It means repositioning friction. Friction must now be introduced intentionally at decision points rather than assumed through effort. This is especially critical under pressure. When time compresses, the temptation is to rely on the first structured output that feels coherent. That is precisely when adversarial prompting is most valuable. Asking the system, what would make this wrong? What assumption, if false, invalidates this conclusion? What risk are we underweighting? These questions reintroduce disciplined discomfort. Discomfort is not dysfunction. It is inspection. If output feels reassuring immediately, caution is warranted. If output surfaces tension, it is doing useful work. Another subtle risk in AI partnership is over-prompting. When prompts become iterative without producing new insight, they shift from inspection to avoidance. More structure does not always equal better judgment. There is a convergence point where additional output adds noise rather than clarity. Recognizing that point is itself a judgment act. AI does not signal when you should stop. You must. Working with AI as a thinking partner is therefore less about clever phrasing and more about disciplined sequencing. Judgment first. Decision structuring second. Execution last, never the reverse. If execution prompting occurs before judgment is settled, language can subtly influence classification. If decision prompting occurs before risk hypotheses are fully formed, framing may be biased by model patterning. If judgment prompting occurs after conclusions have been drafted and shared, disruption increases unnecessarily. Lifecycle alignment matters. AI must align with the stage of thinking, not override it. Selectivity signals maturity. Constant usage signals dependency. Maturity is demonstrated by knowing when not to involve AI. Some conversations require relational sensitivity that cannot be simulated convincingly. Some moments require ethical calibration beyond pattern matching. Some escalations require human presence rather than generated articulation. If every task routes through AI automatically, judgment gradually atrophies. If AI is treated as a disciplined instrument rather than a default reflex, judgment strengthens. The professional who thrives in this environment will not be the one who uses AI most often. It will be the one who uses it most deliberately. Deliberate usage means declaring intent before prompting, naming boundaries explicitly, defining inspection rules consciously, separating exploration from commitment, verifying outputs rigorously, owning conclusions personally. Execution accelerates. Judgment must intensify proportionally. AI can expand thinking. It can also compress it prematurely. Partnership requires recognizing both capacities and governing them intentionally. In this environment, thinking is no longer slowed by drafting effort. It must be slowed by design. And design is the responsibility of the professional, not the tool. Section 5. Workflow as strategy. When AI accelerates output, does your workflow accelerate thinking or collapse decisions into motion? Workflows are not neutral. They encode priorities. They reflect what an organization believes is important. They determine where friction exists and where it does not. They signal what is reviewed carefully and what moves forward automatically. Historically, internal audit workflows were designed around the cost of execution. Documentation took time. Testing required coordination. Reporting required drafting cycles and revision loops. The process itself created checkpoints. AI compresses those cycles. Draft findings can be structured quickly. Control descriptions can be summarized instantly. Comparisons to regulatory guidance can be generated in seconds. The procedural effort embedded in the workflow shrinks. If the workflow remains unchanged while execution accelerates, decisions move faster than inspection. This is the structural risk. If speed increases but confidence in direction declines, what constraint actually shifted? The constraint shifted from drafting to deciding. In many audit processes, the moment of commitment is rarely declared explicitly. Scope is set through conversation. Severity is calibrated through dialogue. Language is refined through iteration. Escalation timing is adjusted based on emerging information. Yet rarely does someone say, "This is where we decide." In the absence of explicit decision points, momentum decides. Momentum is not inherently flawed. It is efficient. It creates progress. But under acceleration, momentum can bypass scrutiny. When is the moment named where choice becomes irreversible? Some decisions are reversible. A draft can be revised. A scope can be expanded. A classification can be recalibrated before reporting. Other decisions are less reversible. Once a finding is presented to the audit committee, narrative framing hardens. Once severity is recorded in formal documentation, reputational impact may follow. Once an issue is classified publicly, reclassification carries cost. If reversibility differs across decisions, workflow must reflect that asymmetry. Are assumptions explicit or implied? Workflow that does not require articulation of assumptions encourages implicit reasoning. Implicit reasoning is fragile because it cannot be inspected. For example, if severity classification does not require documentation of the criteria applied, calibration drift becomes more likely. If escalation timing is not linked to documented thresholds, delay can be rationalized quietly. AI can accelerate each step. It cannot embed guardrails automatically. If no one declares, "This is where we decide," does momentum decide instead? Under acceleration, the answer is often yes. AI-generated drafts can make decisions feel settled because they appear complete. Structured language gives the impression of closure. Balanced phrasing reduces perceived tension. Closure may be illusory. Workflow must therefore introduce intentional separation between exploration and commitment. Exploration expands options. It surfaces alternatives. It tests hypotheses. AI is powerful in this phase because it can generate comparisons and challenge assumptions efficiently. Commitment narrows options. It accepts trade-offs. It anchors conclusions in evidence. It requires ownership. If exploration and commitment blur, premature closure becomes likely. Without narrowing, what happens to clarity? Abundance can create noise. When AI enables unlimited scenario generation, unlimited comparative tables, unlimited redrafting, the temptation is to continue exploring rather than decide. Exploration feels rigorous. It can also become avoidance. If insight scales faster than attention, attention becomes the bottleneck. The workflow must protect attention deliberately. Protection means defining when enough exploration has occurred. It means specifying what evidence threshold must be met before classification. It means naming when escalation criteria are triggered. If these thresholds are not explicit, acceleration amplifies inconsistency. Inconsistent calibration erodes credibility. Consistency does not mean rigidity, it means proportionality. Workflow as strategy means designing process intentionally around where judgment matters most. For example, planning workflows should require explicit articulation of risk rationale, not just risk lists. Fieldwork workflows should separate evidence gathering from preliminary classification. Reporting workflows should require documented linkage between evidence strength and severity level. Escalation workflows should define timing thresholds clearly. AI can support each step. It cannot replace the structural logic embedded in the workflow. Another strategic dimension of workflow is language review. AI-drafted narratives may subtly alter tone. They may reduce perceived severity by softening adjectives. They may increase certainty through confident phrasing. They may compress nuance in the interest of clarity. If workflow does not include structured review of tone relative to evidence strength, drift occurs. Drift is not dramatic. It is incremental. One softened phrase, one balanced qualifier, one moderate classification where significant might have been justified. Over time, drift alters exposure. Workflow must also protect verification boundaries. AI-generated summaries are not evidence. They are interpretations of evidence. If workflow does not require direct reference to source material before finalization, reliance risk increases. Verification is not distrust of the tool. It is protection of independence. Independence is not simply absence of bias, it is visible discipline. Visible discipline is demonstrated through process. Process signals seriousness. If AI reduces drafting effort, some may assume process can be streamlined equivalently. Streamlining is appropriate in execution. It is dangerous in judgment. Workflow must make explicit where friction is required. Friction in this context means required documentation of assumptions, mandatory adversarial review at high severity thresholds, explicit separation between exploratory analysis and final classification, formal acknowledgement of reversibility. Reversibility is particularly important under acceleration. Some audit decisions can be revisited with minimal cost. Others create reputational or regulatory implications that are difficult to unwind. Workflow must treat these differently. If classification of a moderate issue is reversible, but classification of a significant issue triggers mandatory reporting, the friction applied should differ. AI cannot determine appropriate friction. It can assist in analyzing consequences. The weighting remains human. Another dimension of workflow strategy is escalation timing. When AI accelerates information flow, pressure to respond quickly increases. Stakeholders may expect rapid feedback because drafting is faster. But speed in articulation does not eliminate the need for careful calibration. If escalation occurs before evidence strength is sufficient, credibility suffers. If escalation is delayed because narrative is still being refined, exposure increases. Workflow must define the balance. This balance should not be improvised under pressure. It should be pre-structured. Pre-structuring reduces emotional influence at the moment of decision. Emotional influence increases under acceleration. When silence feels uncomfortable, speed feels safer. Workflow must protect the space where hesitation is productive. Productive hesitation is not delay for its own sake. It is time allocated for verification, assumption testing, and adversarial review. AI can assist adversarial review. For example, what assumption, if incorrect, would invalidate this severity classification? What external perspective would most strongly challenge this conclusion? What would a regulator question first in this narrative? Embedding such prompts at specific workflow stages reintroduces disciplined friction. Friction is not inefficiency, it is control. Workflow as strategy recognizes that control over thinking is as important as control over execution. When execution was slow, thinking often kept pace naturally. When execution accelerates, thinking must be governed intentionally. The design of the process becomes a strategic lever. If process rewards throughput exclusively, throughput will dominate. If process rewards documented reasoning, reasoning will strengthen. If process embeds adversarial review before finalization, calibration consistency increases. If process requires explicit articulation of trade-offs, implicit bias decreases. AI amplifies whatever the workflow encodes. If workflow encodes speed, AI amplifies speed. If workflow encodes discernment, AI amplifies discernment. Therefore, workflow is not administrative. It is strategic. It determines whether acceleration enhances or erodes judgment. In an AI-enabled environment, internal audit must treat workflow as an instrument of discernment rather than merely a checklist of tasks. Execution accelerates. Judgment must be structurally protected. Workflow is where that protection lives. Section 6, where AI breaks and how judgment catches it. If fluency creates confidence, what replaces scrutiny? AI rarely fails in obvious ways. It does not typically produce chaotic reasoning or visibly fractured logic. Its outputs are structured, its tone is balanced, its arguments appear sequenced. In many cases, it sounds more composed than the human under time pressure. That is precisely why subtle failure becomes dangerous. When an answer is coherent, what assumptions go unexamined? Coherence is a property of structure, not proof of truth. AI arranges language in statistically likely sequences. It predicts plausible continuations. It fills transitions smoothly. It produces narratives that feel complete. Completion is not validation. In internal audit, validation depends on evidence strength, contextual risk weighting, documented criteria, and alignment with mandate. AI cannot intuit your mandate unless you declare it explicitly. It cannot feel reputational sensitivity unless you define it. It cannot detect political fragility unless you describe it. If momentum builds before doubt appears, when does correction become too late? Under acceleration, teams move quickly from question to narrative. Draft findings are generated early. Preliminary severity is structured before full evidence is absorbed. Discussions begin anchored to language that feels finished. Anchoring matters. The first coherent articulation of a risk often becomes the reference point for subsequent discussion. Even if evidence evolves, the initial framing exerts gravitational pull. This is narrative lock-in. AI accelerates narrative lock-in because it produces early structure effortlessly. Once structure exists, revision feels like disruption. Judgment must therefore intervene before narrative hardens. If everyone assumes someone else will verify, who actually does? AI-generated outputs can create a diffusion of responsibility. If a summary appears comprehensive, reviewers may focus on tone rather than substance. If a comparison table looks balanced, participants may assume dimensions are complete. But appearance of completeness is not confirmation of sufficiency. Verification must be explicit. Verification is not distrust of the tool. It is protection of independence. If confirmation is easier than contradiction, which one scales faster? Confirmation scales. Contradiction requires energy. It requires discomfort. It requires someone to interrupt momentum. Under pressure, interruption feels risky. Yet failure to interrupt early increases downstream cost. AI also introduces subtle calibration drift. Consider severity classification. AI can draft language aligned with typical moderate findings. It may soften phrasing to maintain neutrality. It may balance risk description with mitigating controls to appear objective. But objectivity without proportionality can underweight exposure. If assumptions remain unstated, what anchors the decision? Severity criteria must be applied consciously, not implied through tone. If trade-offs are unnamed, what goes unowned? Trade-offs are central to audit judgment. Escalating an issue may strain relationships. Delaying escalation may increase exposure. Softening language may reduce immediate friction. Hardening language may increase scrutiny. These trade-offs exist whether named or not. AI does not eliminate trade-offs. It can obscure them by presenting balanced language that feels reasonable. Reasonableness is not the same as alignment with mandate. Another failure point emerges in evidence summarization. AI can summarize large volumes of documentation quickly. It can identify themes. It can cluster findings. It can extract recurring patterns. But summarization compresses nuance. Nuance may contain the signal. If a small anomaly appears repeatedly but does not dominate the dataset, summarization may downweight it. If a pattern is common across industries but atypical in your context, summarization may overemphasize it. Judgment must therefore interrogate summaries rather than accept them. What is missing from this synthesis? What minority signals are underrepresented? What contextual elements are flattened? AI also struggles with asymmetry. In many audit contexts, downside risk is asymmetric. A low probability event may carry catastrophic consequence. A moderate control weakness may carry disproportionate reputational exposure given recent events. Pattern-based reasoning often emphasizes central tendencies. It does not naturally prioritize tail risk unless instructed. Judgment must weight asymmetry deliberately. Failure also appears in timing. AI can accelerate drafting to such an extent that reporting cycles compress. Stakeholders may expect rapid updates because language is available quickly. But availability of language does not equate to readiness of conclusion. If reporting accelerates without commensurate verification, credibility erodes. Credibility is not lost because AI was used. It is lost when conclusions appear reactive, inconsistent, or insufficiently supported. Another point of breakage lies in overconfidence amplification. If a professional already leans toward a conclusion, AI can generate supportive arguments quickly. It can supply reinforcement at scale. It can articulate rationale more fluently than the original thought. This creates confirmation amplification. Without adversarial prompting, AI will often cooperate with the direction implied in the input. If you ask, "Why is this control design sufficient?" it will generate supportive reasoning. If you ask, "Why might this be insufficient?" it will generate challenge. The direction of inquiry matters. Judgment must therefore control inquiry framing. Framing is not neutral. If the problem is framed as "optimize this process," AI will optimize. If it is framed as "stress test this assumption," AI will stress test. Where AI breaks is often at the seam between pattern and context. It handles pattern reliably. It does not inherently understand context. Context includes organizational risk appetite, regulatory climate, recent public scrutiny, board sensitivity, cultural dynamics, incentive structures. If these are not embedded in the prompting or overlaid during review, output may drift toward generic norms. Generic norms are not always aligned with your exposure. Judgment catches what pattern misses. Judgment asks, does this align with our criteria? Does this reflect our exposure? Does this language match our evidence strength? Would I defend this under scrutiny? Would I defend this 5 years from now? The final question is particularly important. AI optimizes for present plausibility. Judgment must consider future hindsight. How will this decision age? If a classification later appears lenient, how will it be interpreted? If escalation timing appears delayed, how will that be viewed? If narrative tone appears understated, what will hindsight reveal? AI cannot feel hindsight. Judgment must simulate it. Where AI breaks, judgment must embed guardrails. Guardrails include mandatory adversarial review for high-severity issues, explicit documentation of assumptions for classification decisions, verification checkpoints before finalization, separation between exploratory analysis and final reporting language. These guardrails are not about restricting AI. They are about protecting mandate. Mandate includes independence, skepticism, and defensibility. AI can assist in fulfilling mandate. It can also undermine it if ungoverned. Execution accelerates. Pattern recognition scales. Narrative formation speeds up. But professional accountability remains constant. AI does not absorb liability. It does not attend regulatory reviews. It does not defend conclusions before committees. You do. Therefore, wherever AI breaks, judgment must catch it. And catching it requires structure, not instinct. Structure is the theme of the next section. Section 7. Durable advantage in a fast-moving AI world. When capability half-lives shrink, what actually compounds? Tools evolve rapidly. Features update quietly. Interfaces improve. What felt advanced 6 months ago becomes standard. What felt differentiating becomes baseline. If fluency resets every quarter, depth cannot depend on tools. Durable advantage must live somewhere else. In an AI-accelerated environment, professionals who anchor their identity to tool mastery will feel periodic instability. Every update erodes perceived edge. Every new feature resets the learning curve. But professionals who anchor their identity to judgment remain stable. Judgment compounds. Calibration compounds, credibility compounds, influence compounds. These are not disrupted by interface changes. Execution capability is increasingly democratized. Discernment is not. If visibility fades as access spreads, what remains scarce? Scarcity shifts to disciplined interpretation. Public announcements about AI often emphasize productivity gains. Faster drafting, quicker analysis, more automated comparisons. These are horizontal gains. Horizontal gains make everyone faster. Vertical gains make someone more trusted. Vertical gain is not about doing more. It is about shaping direction. As AI becomes embedded in other enterprise systems, its presence will become less visible. It will operate quietly inside document platforms, workflow systems, risk dashboards. The novelty will fade. The expectation of speed will not. If everyone assumes acceleration, what becomes strategic? Strategic behavior becomes selectivity. When everything can be analyzed quickly, not everything should be analyzed equally. When every scenario can be modeled, not every scenario deserves equal weight. When every narrative can be drafted, not every narrative should be finalized. Durable advantage lies in knowing where not to invest energy. Overreaction is common in fast-moving environments. Every tool update feels urgent. Every new capability appears transformative. Every improvement invites experimentation. Experimentation is useful. Chasing novelty is not strategy. If nothing structural moved, reacting to noise wastes attention. If something structural did move, focus must narrow. What has shifted permanently? The cost of producing structured language has dropped. The baseline expectation of clarity has risen. The tolerance for delay has decreased. What has not shifted? Accountability remains. Regulatory scrutiny remains. The requirement for evidence remains. The expectation of independence remains. When you strip away the novelty, the mandate of internal audit remains constant. It is to provide independent assurance, calibrated insight, and defensible conclusions. I can support these objectives. It does not redefine them. Therefore, durable advantage is built on strengthening what does not change. This includes deep familiarity with severity criteria, consistent application of escalation thresholds, transparent documentation of reasoning, structured adversarial review, early involvement in risk framing. These behaviors compound trust. Trust expands access. Access expands leverage. Leverage creates influence. Influence shapes exposure. This is the durable loop. Another dimension of durability is resilience under scrutiny. When an issue is questioned months later, can you reconstruct the reasoning clearly? When classification is challenged, can you articulate the criteria applied? When escalation timing is examined, can you explain why it occurred when it did? AI can assist reconstruction if reasoning was documented. It cannot recreate undocumented judgment. Documentation of reasoning, not just outcome, is critical. Outcome documentation states what was decided. Reasoning documentation explains why. In an AI-accelerated world, Outcome documentation becomes easier. Reasoning documentation requires discipline. Durable professionals distinguish between the two. They do not rely solely on polished narrative. They preserve inspection trails. Durability also requires emotional steadiness. Acceleration increases pressure. Pressure compresses time. Compression amplifies expectation. When stakeholders expect immediate articulation, hesitation feels like weakness. But disciplined hesitation can be strength. The ability to say, "We are not ready to conclude yet," even when language is available, signals maturity. Speed is not the only dimension of competence. Calibration is. As capability spreads, visible differentiation decreases. Invisible differentiation becomes more important. Invisible differentiation includes the quality of questions asked, the consistency of severity calibration, the clarity of trade-off articulation, the steadiness under momentum. These are not flashy. They are durable. AI proficiency may influence short-term efficiency. Judgment consistency influences long-term credibility. In fast-moving environments, the temptation is to equate adaptation with constant change. But adaptation sometimes means protecting core standards more firmly. When acceleration increases, guardrails must tighten. Guardrails do not inhibit innovation. They channel it. For internal audit, durable advantage will not come from using AI more than everyone else. It will come from using it more deliberately. It will come from aligning its usage with lifecycle stages. It will come from embedding verification boundaries. It will come from protecting adversarial thinking. It will come from separating exploration from commitment consistently. These are structural advantages. They are not dependent on tool version. They are dependent on professional discipline. Another risk in fast-moving environments is drift toward convenience. If AI makes drafting easy, teams may unconsciously optimize for narrative elegance over analytical depth. If AI makes comparison effortless, teams may rely on template alignment rather than contextual weighting. Convenience can erode rigor quietly. Durable advantage resists convenience when it conflicts with mandate. Mandate is not flexible. Independence is not optional. Skepticism is not situational. Proportionality is not aesthetic. These standards persist regardless of tool acceleration. The professionals who internalize this distinction will feel less destabilized by rapid change. They will treat AI as an instrument rather than an identity. They will remain steady when interfaces evolve. They will focus on where leverage truly resides. Execution accelerates. Judgment compounds. Durability belongs to those who invest in what compounds. Section 8. Leading when speed, risk, and ambiguity collide. When time compresses, what disappears first? Analysis or hesitation? Under pressure, organizations do not suddenly become irrational. They become predictable. They gravitate toward momentum. They prioritize reassurance. They favor coherent narratives over incomplete truths. AI amplifies that tendency. When answers can be generated instantly, silence shortens. When silence shortens, reflection contracts. When reflection contracts, premature closure becomes more likely. Speed feels like control. And in moments of uncertainty, control feels stabilizing. If a coherent story reduces anxiety, how quickly does it become the story? The first structured narrative often anchors the room. It aligns participants. It reduces ambiguity. It enables forward motion. Even if the narrative is provisional, it begins to harden simply because it exists. AI accelerates this anchoring effect. Draft language appears early. Comparison tables are generated quickly. Counterarguments are surfaced within seconds. The velocity of articulation outpaces the velocity of absorption. Absorption requires time. Absorption requires discomfort. Absorption requires the willingness to hold ambiguity longer than feels comfortable. Leading in this environment requires recognizing that speed does not reduce risk. It redistributes it. When attribution expands, what contracts? Consider the subtle shift in language. The model indicates. The analysis suggests. Based on the output. These phrases distribute authority outward. They create distance between conclusion and ownership. Under pressure, this distance feels protective. It is not. Responsibility does not migrate with phrasing. In high-stakes moments, escalation decisions, significant issue classifications, regulatory exposure, the individual accountable remains accountable regardless of how language was generated. Leadership in this environment requires reclaiming ownership explicitly. This is our conclusion. This classification reflects our criteria. We accept this risk. Ownership clarifies authority. Authority clarifies accountability. Accountability strengthens trust. Another dynamic emerges when speed intersects with reputational exposure. When reputational sensitivity is high, leadership often seeks rapid clarity. Rapid clarity feels stabilizing to stakeholders. It demonstrates action. But rapid clarity without calibrated evidence can create fragility. If subsequent information contradicts early articulation, credibility erodes. The tension between timeliness and sufficiency intensifies under AI acceleration. Language availability should not be mistaken for decision readiness. Decision readiness requires evidence strength aligned with classification, explicit articulation of assumptions, consideration of reversibility, awareness of downstream consequence. Reversibility is a critical lens in compressed environments. Some decisions can be adjusted quietly. Others cannot. If a preliminary classification is communicated internally, revision may be manageable. If a classification is communicated externally or to a governing body, revision may signal instability. Leading under compression requires asking, is this decision reversible? If yes, speed may be acceptable. If no, friction must increase. AI does not assess reversibility unless prompted. Judgment must. Another tension appears in dissent management. Acceleration can suppress dissent unintentionally. If a coherent narrative is generated early and shared widely, alternative perspectives may feel redundant or disruptive. Participants may assume objections were already considered because the document appears comprehensive. Comprehensiveness can silence challenge. Leaders must therefore actively invite adversarial perspectives. This is not about fostering conflict. It is about protecting calibration. Questions such as, what assumption are we leaning on most heavily? What would a skeptical regulator question first? What downside risk might we be underweighting? These questions reintroduce disciplined discomfort. Discomfort signals inspection. In compressed environments, inspection must be intentional. Another leadership challenge under acceleration is emotional contagion. When information moves quickly, reactions move quickly. Concern spreads faster. Reassurance spreads faster. Pressure intensifies more rapidly. AI can amplify emotional momentum by generating urgent-sounding summaries or structured risk narratives that appear severe. Leaders must distinguish between structural risk and narrative tone. Tone can exaggerate or minimize perceived exposure. Calibrated leadership requires aligning tone with evidence strength. If evidence is preliminary, tone must reflect provisional status. If evidence is strong and exposure significant, Tone must not soften unnecessarily. AI can assist drafting. It cannot feel reputational stakes. Leadership also requires protecting independence under relational pressure. When management provides AI-generated analyses to support their position, those analyses may appear polished and balanced. They may preemptively address counter-arguments. They may include comparative benchmarks. The polish can create subtle persuasion. Audit leadership must interrogate structure, not be influenced by it. Questions must focus on evidence linkage, not narrative fluency. Show me the underlying support. What criteria were applied? How were outliers treated? These questions anchor discussion in substance. AI acceleration does not eliminate the need for courage. It may increase it. When momentum builds quickly, interrupting it requires steadiness. When consensus forms around a coherent narrative, challenging it requires composure. When stakeholders expect rapid answers, requesting additional verification requires confidence. Leadership in this context is not about resisting technology. It is about resisting premature closure. The leader who thrives will not be the fastest to articulate. It will be the most calibrated to decide. Calibrated leadership distinguishes between clarity and certainty, speed and sufficiency, confidence and correctness, consensus and alignment with mandate. These distinctions are subtle. They are easy to articulate in calm conditions and difficult to enforce under pressure. AI compresses cycles. Compression magnifies misalignment. Therefore, leadership must embed structure into rapid processes. Structure includes defined decision checkpoints, explicit reversibility assessment, documented assumption articulation, mandatory adversarial review for high-impact matters, clear ownership statements in final conclusions. These structural elements create resilience. Resilience under acceleration is the ultimate test of disciplined AI integration. The objective is not to slow progress artificially. It is to ensure that progress does not outrun calibration. In a fast-moving AI world, leadership credibility depends less on technical mastery and more on judgment visibility. Judgment visibility is created through transparent reasoning, explicit ownership, proportional language, consistent criteria application. When speed, risk, and ambiguity collide, the professional who can hold tension without collapsing into premature closure becomes indispensable. Execution accelerates. Narrative formation accelerates. Expectation accelerates. Judgment must remain steady. And steadiness under compression is leadership. Section 9. The economic shift from production to selection. AI lowers the cost of producing audit artifacts. That single sentence carries structural implications. Summaries, draft findings, control descriptions, comparative analyses, regulatory cross-references. All of these can now be generated quickly, coherently, and at scale. What once required extended drafting cycles now requires structured prompting. When production becomes inexpensive, it stops signaling quality. Historically, the visible artifact functioned as evidence of rigor. Length implied depth, density implied effort, iteration implied care. But when AI can produce density and polish instantly, visible effort decouples from visible output. This changes incentives. If production is cheap, what becomes expensive? Selection, prioritization, attention. In an abundant information environment, scarcity migrates. Time to draft becomes less scarce. Time to decide becomes more scarce. The economic shift is subtle but decisive. In prior models, internal audit demonstrated value by showing work performed. In emerging models, Internal audit demonstrates value by showing disciplined selection. Which risks were examined? Which were deprioritized? Which were escalated early? Which were reframed before becoming public? The differentiator moves from how much was done to what was chosen. AI increases optionality. Optionality can be empowering. Optionality can also dilute focus. When everything can be analyzed quickly, the temptation is to analyze everything. But analyzing everything is not strategy. Strategy is exclusion. Exclusion requires conviction. Conviction requires reasoning. If production scales horizontally, judgment scales vertically. Horizontal scaling makes teams faster. Vertical scaling makes them more influential. Influence compounds. Influence is built on consistency of calibration. Consistency is built on clarity of criteria. Criteria must be applied intentionally. AI does not inherently apply your criteria. It applies generalized patterns unless instructed otherwise. This is where economic leverage concentrates. The cost of being articulate has dropped. The cost of being wrong has not. If drafting is cheap but misclassification remains expensive, energy must shift toward classification discipline. If summaries are easy but escalation timing remains consequential, attention must shift toward timing calibration. The economic shift, therefore, demands reallocation of cognitive effort. Less energy toward drafting mechanics, more energy toward decision architecture. Decision architecture includes explicit severity thresholds, defined escalation triggers, documented evidence standards, structured adversarial review. These elements govern how decisions are made under acceleration. Acceleration increases velocity. Velocity increases consequence speed. Consequence speed reduces margin for correction. This is why the shift from production to selection is not optional. It is structural. Another dimension of the economic shift is expectation alignment. As AI becomes embedded across enterprise functions, management will operate with similar tools. Risk assessments may arrive already structured. Analyses may be presented with comparative benchmarks. Issue responses may be drafted coherently. The expectation gap narrows. Audit is no longer the only function capable of structured articulation. Therefore, articulation alone does not differentiate. Interrogation differentiates. Calibration differentiates. Selection differentiates. If visible output converges, invisible reasoning becomes decisive. Invisible reasoning must therefore be made visible. Visible reasoning does not mean verbose documentation. It means transparent articulation of why a conclusion was reached, why this risk was prioritized, why this classification was applied, why this escalation timing was chosen. When reasoning is inspectable, credibility increases. When reasoning is implicit, credibility depends on reputation alone. Reputation alone is fragile under acceleration. AI also introduces economic efficiency that can unintentionally create overconfidence. If a full draft can be produced in minutes, teams may feel ahead of schedule. The perceived efficiency gain can create psychological slack. Slack can reduce scrutiny. If the document looks finished, the mind shifts to review rather than interrogation. But review of language is not review of reasoning. The economic shift requires a shift in review posture. From, "Does this read clearly?" to, "Does this reflect calibrated judgment?" From, "Is this structured properly?" to, "Is this supported proportionally?" From, "Is this complete?" to, "Is this sufficient?" Sufficiency is contextual. Sufficiency depends on consequence. Low-impact matters may tolerate lighter inspection. High-impact matters demand heavier friction. Friction must scale with consequence, not with drafting difficulty. AI reduces drafting difficulty. It does not reduce consequence. The economic shift therefore compels internal audit to treat judgment as the scarce resource. Scarce resources must be protected. Protected through explicit decision checkpoints, documented assumption articulation, mandatory adversarial review for high-severity issues, clear ownership language in conclusions. Ownership language is critical. If authority is attributed to analysis rather than to accountable professionals, the perception of ownership diffuses. Diffused ownership erodes trust. Trust compounds when accountability is visible. The economic shift is not about productivity optimization. It is about leverage reallocation. Leverage now resides in disciplined selectivity. Selectivity requires clarity of mandate. Mandate clarity requires leadership articulation. Leadership articulation requires alignment across the function. If internal evaluation still rewards volume primarily, teams will optimize volume. If evaluation rewards influence and calibration consistency, teams will optimize judgment. Economic structures shape behavior. AI reshapes economic structures of production. Internal audit must reshape its internal incentives accordingly. The function that thrives will not be the one that produces the most documentation. It will be the one that consistently selects the right battles early enough to matter. Execution accelerates, selection differentiates, judgment compounds, and the economic shift makes that reality unavoidable. Section 10. Prompting as professional discipline. Prompting is not a technical trick. It is a declaration of intent. Every prompt contains an implicit instruction about what kind of thinking is being requested. If that instruction is vague, the output will default to coherence rather than calibration. Professional prompting begins before the first word is typed. It begins with clarity. What stage of thinking am I in? Am I exploring? Am I structuring a decision? Am I finalizing language after judgment has occurred? Confusing these stages is where silent failure begins. If you use execution-style prompting before judgment is complete, language can subtly shape classification. If you use decision-style prompting without explicit boundaries, output may drift toward recommendation rather than comparison. If you use judgment-style prompting too late, disruption increases and trust can be strained. Lifecycle alignment is the first discipline. Exploration prompts expand possibility. They ask for alternatives, counter-arguments, comparative frameworks. They should not commit. Decision prompts structure consequences. They clarify trade-offs. They outline implications. They should not decide. Execution prompts refine language after judgment has already occurred. They improve clarity without changing substance. Judgment prompts stress test assumptions. They surface fragility. They challenge confidence. They introduce discomfort intentionally. The professional must declare internally which mode is active. Without declaration, AI defaults to answering. Answering is not always appropriate. Another discipline of prompting is boundary clarity. Boundaries define what is not being decided. For example, we are not reassessing severity, only drafting language. We are comparing escalation timing, not recommending one. We are stress testing this classification, not generating alternatives. Without explicit boundaries, output may overstep. Overstepping is subtle. Language may strengthen a conclusion unintentionally. Tone may shift from provisional to confident. Trade-offs may be resolved prematurely. Inspection rules must also be defined. Inspection rules determine how uncertainty is surfaced. Should weak evidence be highlighted? Should confidence levels be stated explicitly? Should minority risk signals be emphasized? If inspection rules are not specified, output optimizes for fluency. Fluency can conceal fragility. Professional prompting requires specifying how doubt should appear. For example, identify the two strongest counterarguments. Surface the weakest assumption in this reasoning. Explain where this classification might be challenged. These prompts reintroduce disciplined skepticism. Another element of discipline is ownership. After any AI-assisted drafting, the professional must ask, did certainty increase because evidence strengthened, or because language improved? If confidence feels stronger solely due to structure, recalibration is required. Ownership means being able to state, I accept this conclusion based on these criteria and this evidence. If that sentence cannot be completed independently of the tool, the work is not finished. Prompting discipline also includes stopping discipline. AI can generate endless variations. More structure, more scenarios, more articulation. Iteration feels productive. But iteration without new insight is noise. Professional discipline includes recognizing the convergence point, where additional output does not change understanding. Stopping is a judgment act. Another dimension of prompting discipline is tone calibration. AI often defaults to balanced language. Balanced language can understate material exposure. If the underlying evidence is strong and consequence significant, tone must reflect that proportionally. Tone discipline requires reviewing output not only for clarity, but for alignment with risk weighting. If tone and consequence diverge, revision is required. Verification remains non-negotiable. AI output is not evidence, it is a structured interpretation. Before finalization, evidence must be traced. Does the narrative align with documented support? Does the severity reflect criteria application? Does the escalation timing reflect defined thresholds? If not, correction precedes conclusion. Prompting discipline is therefore less about clever phrasing and more about structured sequencing. Intent first. Boundaries second. Inspection third. Verification fourth. Ownership always. Without this sequence, acceleration amplifies risk. With this sequence, acceleration amplifies leverage. Professional discipline transforms AI from a productivity enhancer into a calibrated instrument. It preserves independence. It strengthens credibility. It aligns speed with sufficiency. Execution accelerates. Prompting governs acceleration. Judgment remains the anchor. Section 11. Lifecycle alignment. Preventing silent drift. If prompting is disciplined, but lifecycle alignment is not, what happens? Even well-structured prompts can introduce risk if they are applied at the wrong stage of the audit lifecycle. The audit lifecycle is not merely administrative sequencing, it is cognitive sequencing. Each stage requires a different posture of thinking. Planning requires hypothesis formation. Fieldwork requires evidence evaluation. Reporting requires calibrated articulation. Escalation requires consequence weighting. If AI is applied uniformly across these stages without differentiation, silent drift occurs. Silent drift is not obvious error. It is incremental misalignment. In planning, the risk is premature narrowing. If AI is used to generate risk lists based on industry patterns before contextual understanding is fully developed, scope can become anchored to generic exposure rather than organization-specific vulnerability. Generic risk identification feels comprehensive. Comprehensive is not the same as relevant. Planning requires contextual framing before pattern matching. Therefore, AI should support brainstorming only after mandate, risk appetite, and environmental sensitivity have been articulated clearly. In fieldwork, the risk is narrative anchoring. If preliminary findings are drafted early based on partial evidence, those narratives may shape interpretation of subsequent data. Language influences perception. Perception influences interpretation. Interpretation influences classification. Lifecycle alignment requires separating evidence absorption from narrative formation. Evidence first, narrative later. AI can assist with summarization, but classification must not crystallize prematurely. In reporting, the risk is tonal drift. AI-generated drafts may optimize for clarity and balance. Balance can understate material exposure if mitigating language is introduced reflexively. Reporting requires proportionality. Proportionality requires evidence weighting. AI can structure articulation. It cannot weight reputational exposure intuitively. Lifecycle alignment means reviewing tone relative to severity criteria explicitly. In escalation, the risk is timing compression. When drafting becomes instantaneous, pressure to communicate increases. Stakeholders may expect rapid articulation because language is available quickly. But availability of language does not equal readiness of decision. Escalation must reflect consequence, not convenience. Lifecycle alignment requires differentiating between articulation readiness and decision readiness. If these blur, credibility erodes. Another subtle misalignment occurs when decision prompting is used during exploration. For example, asking AI to recommend the best classification during early evidence gathering embeds directional bias before sufficient information is available. Exploration should expand options. Decision prompting narrows options. Using narrowing prompts too early collapses optionality. Conversely, using exploratory prompting too late can destabilize settled conclusions unnecessarily. If a finding is fully supported and documented, inviting additional alternatives at the final stage may introduce confusion rather than clarity. Lifecycle alignment is therefore about timing discipline. Right tool, right stage, right intent, right boundary. Without alignment, drift accumulates. Drift is dangerous because it appears harmless in isolation. One early narrative drafted prematurely. One classification influenced subtly by balanced phrasing. One escalation accelerated due to language availability. Individually minor, collectively material. Preventing silent drift requires structured checkpoints. Planning checkpoint. Are we anchored in mandate and context before leveraging pattern-based risk generation? Fieldwork checkpoint. Has classification been separated from preliminary narrative drafting? Reporting checkpoint. Does tone align proportionally with evidence strength and consequence? Escalation checkpoint. Has reversibility been assessed explicitly before communication? These checkpoints are not bureaucratic. They are cognitive guardrails. AI amplifies whatever stage misalignment exists. If lifecycle discipline is strong, AI enhances clarity. If lifecycle discipline is weak, AI accelerates inconsistency. Alignment also protects independence. Independence erodes not through overt compromise, but through gradual accommodation. If language consistently softens under pressure, calibration drifts. If severity thresholds fluctuate across engagements, credibility weakens. Lifecycle alignment ensures that criteria application remains consistent regardless of acceleration. Another component of alignment is documentation of reasoning. Each stage should capture not only outcome, but rationale. Why was this risk prioritized? Why was this classification applied? Why was this escalation timing chosen? AI can help articulate rationale. It cannot generate authentic reasoning if reasoning has not occurred. Authentic reasoning precedes articulation. Alignment therefore requires slowing down at inflection points, even when language can be produced instantly. Slowing down does not mean inefficiency. It means proportional friction. High-consequence decisions deserve more friction. Low-consequence decisions may tolerate less. Friction scales with impact. AI reduces mechanical friction. Lifecycle alignment reintroduces intentional friction. Intentional friction is protective. Without it, acceleration becomes destabilizing. With it, acceleration becomes strategic. Execution accelerates. Lifecycle alignment protects judgment across stages. Drift is silent. Discipline is visible. Alignment makes discipline structural rather than situational. Section 12. The verification boundary. Protecting independence under acceleration. AI-generated output is not evidence. It is structured language derived from patterns. That distinction must remain non-negotiable. As acceleration increases, the temptation to treat AI summaries as substitutes for source review grows. A large body of documentation can be synthesized quickly. Control descriptions can be paraphrased. Meeting transcripts can be condensed. Regulatory comparisons can be structured. Synthesis is not substantiation. If verification boundaries weaken, independence weakens. Independence is not simply absence of bias. It is visible discipline in how conclusions are formed and defended. The verification boundary defines where AI assistance stops and professional responsibility begins. If that boundary is blurred, credibility erodes quietly. Consider evidence summarization. AI can extract themes from testing results and cluster findings logically. It can identify recurring patterns in control failures. It can compare internal language against regulatory guidance. But AI cannot confirm whether the extracted theme reflects the most material risk. It cannot detect whether nuance in a minority of samples signals disproportionate exposure. It cannot judge whether the pattern identified is an artifact of phrasing rather than substance. Verification requires returning to source material. It requires asking, does this summary accurately reflect the underlying evidence? Has anything been flattened or overstated? Are outliers underrepresented? Does tone align with strength of support? The boundary is crossed when AI-generated synthesis is accepted without inspection. The boundary is reinforced when synthesis is interrogated deliberately. Another dimension of the verification boundary involves classification. AI can propose severity levels based on described impact and likelihood. It can benchmark against generic industry standards. It can articulate rationale aligned with common criteria. But only the accountable professional understands contextual weighting. Has there been recent scrutiny in this domain? Is the board particularly sensitive to this category of risk? Has similar exposure been escalated previously? Context shapes consequence. If classification is influenced primarily by generic benchmarks rather than contextual overlay, calibration drifts. Verification must therefore include explicit criteria reference. Which documented threshold does this classification align with? What evidence supports that alignment? If the answer is unclear, recalibration is required. Verification also protects against confirmation amplification. If a professional leans toward a conclusion, AI can generate supporting reasoning fluently. Without adversarial prompting, reinforcement scales faster than contradiction. The verification boundary requires deliberate counterbalance. What would challenge this conclusion? What evidence would contradict this classification? What assumption is most fragile? Verification discipline includes seeking disconfirming inputs intentionally. Another subtle risk lies in language refinement. AI can polish narrative tone. It can balance phrasing. It can introduce qualifiers that reduce perceived certainty. Polish can create a perception of objectivity. But objectivity without proportionality is distortion. If the underlying evidence is strong and material, language must reflect that strength. If the evidence is limited, language must reflect provisional status. Tone must track evidence. Verification requires reading drafts not only for clarity, but for alignment between language and support. The verification boundary is also temporal. Acceleration compresses review cycles. When drafts appear quickly, review windows shrink. The sense of readiness increases simply because articulation is complete. But readiness of articulation does not equal readiness of decision. Verification must be protected from time compression. This may require explicit pause points before finalization. Pause points are not inefficiencies. They are safeguards. Another element of the boundary is documentation transparency. If AI was used in drafting, that fact alone does not weaken credibility. What weakens credibility is inability to explain reasoning independently. If asked, can you reconstruct the logic without reference to the tool? Can you articulate what evidence drove this conclusion? What trade-offs were considered? What thresholds were applied? If the reasoning lives primarily in the output rather than in the professional's understanding, the boundary has eroded. The verification boundary protects defensibility. Defensibility is not about avoiding scrutiny. It is about welcoming it. When reasoning is documented clearly and evidence is traceable, scrutiny strengthens credibility rather than threatening it. AI does not eliminate scrutiny, it may increase it. As stakeholders become aware of acceleration, expectations tighten. Why was this not identified earlier? Why was this classified at this level? Why was escalation delayed? These questions are not answered by reference to structured language. They are answered by reference to documented reasoning and applied criteria. The verification boundary therefore requires structured practices. For high-severity issues, mandatory adversarial review, explicit documentation of assumptions, clear linkage between evidence and classification, confirmation that reversibility was considered. For moderate issues, evidence-to-language alignment review, criteria, reference confirmation, tone proportionality check. For exploratory analyses, explicit labeling as exploratory. No commitment language introduced prematurely. Separation between scenario generation and recommendation. Boundaries scale with consequence. They are not uniform, but they are always present. Without a verification boundary, AI becomes not a partner, but a surrogate. Surrogacy undermines independence. Independence is the foundation of Internal Audit's mandate. Acceleration should strengthen mandate execution, not weaken it. The verification boundary ensures that AI remains an instrument. Instruments extend capability. They do not replace accountability. Execution accelerates. Verification anchors. Anchoring protects credibility under acceleration. Section 13. Failure patterns. How discipline quietly erodes. Failure in A. AI integration rarely announces itself. It does not begin with obvious error. It does not begin with reckless reliance. It begins with convenience. Convenience feels harmless. Language is available faster. Structure appears sooner. Comparisons are generated effortlessly. The process feels smoother. Smoothness can conceal drift. Drift is incremental misalignment between mandate and behavior. One softened phrase, one premature classification, One decision framed before assumptions were fully tested, individually insignificant, collectively material. Understanding failure patterns is not about suspicion of technology. It is about suspicion of complacency. One common pattern is mode confusion. Exploration, decision, execution, and judgment are distinct cognitive stages. When prompting blends these stages unconsciously, subtle distortion occurs. If exploratory prompts begin recommending action, optionality narrows prematurely. If execution prompts begin strengthening conclusions, classification drifts. If judgment prompts are introduced after consensus has formed, disruption increases and trust strains. Mode confusion is subtle because output remains coherent. Coherence masks stage misalignment. Another failure pattern is confirmation amplification. AI responds directionally. If a question implies sufficiency, it generates supportive reasoning. If a question implies deficiency, it generates critique. Without deliberate adversarial prompting, reinforcement scales faster than contradiction. Professionals often underestimate how much their own framing influences output. If you enter a prompt leaning toward a conclusion, I will often reinforce that lean. Without structured counterbalance, bias compounds quietly. A third pattern is template dependence. As I generate structured outputs efficiently, teams may rely increasingly on standard phrasing. Standardization can increase consistency. It can also flatten context. Context distinguishes material risk from routine deficiency. If language templates replace contextual weighting, classification homogenizes. Homogenization erodes proportionality. Proportionality is central to credibility. Another failure pattern is narrative anchoring. Early drafts, even labeled as preliminary, influence subsequent thinking. Participants align around structured language because it feels complete. Revisions then become adjustments rather than re-examinations. Anchoring becomes particularly strong when language is polished. Polish signals finality, even when intent was exploratory. If preliminary articulation is necessary, labeling must be explicit and disciplined. Without that, narrative momentum builds. Momentum resists correction. Another pattern is speed substitution. As drafting accelerates, the sense of progress increases. Meetings move faster. Documents appear sooner. Timelines compress. Progress in articulation is mistaken for progress in understanding. Understanding requires absorption and challenge. Acceleration can reduce both. If the workflow rewards turnaround time more visibly than calibration quality, speed substitution becomes normalized. Normalization makes drift harder to detect. There is also the erosion of hesitation. Hesitation is often viewed negatively in fast-moving environments. It can appear indecisive. But hesitation, when intentional, is inspection. Inspection requires pause. If AI reduces natural pause created by drafting effort, professionals must consciously reintroduce pause at decision inflection points. Without pause, closure accelerates. Premature closure is not dramatic failure. It is incremental miscalibration. Another failure pattern is boundary dilution. Verification boundaries may initially be strong. Evidence tracing is rigorous. Criteria reference is explicit. Over time, as comfort with AI increases, boundaries may soften. Summaries are accepted more readily. Tone alignment is assumed. Criteria references are implicit rather than documented. Comfort is the enemy of calibration. Comfort increases as fluency increases. Fluency feels reliable. Reliability of structure is not reliability of judgment. Another pattern is diffusion of ownership. language shifts subtly. The analysis suggests, the model indicates, the output implies. These phrases distribute authority rhetorically. Under pressure, such phrasing feels protective. It is not. Responsibility remains with the professional. Diffusion of ownership weakens credibility when challenged. Failure patterns rarely involve malicious misuse. They involve gradual relaxation of discipline. Relaxation is easier when output quality is high. High-quality structure reduces visible friction. Reduced friction reduces perceived need for scrutiny. Scrutiny declines incrementally. Credibility declines gradually. Another subtle pattern is over-iteration. Because AI can generate infinite variations, teams may continue refining language long after reasoning has converged. Iteration without new insight wastes attention. Attention is scarce. When attention is spent on marginal refinements, less remains for material risk weighting. Recognizing convergence is a judgment act. Without stopping discipline, productivity masquerades as progress. Failure patterns are amplified by silence. If no one names these risks explicitly, drift remains invisible. Naming patterns creates awareness. Awareness creates structure. Structure prevents normalization of misalignment. The goal is not suspicion. It is vigilance. Vigilance does not require constant anxiety. It requires clear standards. Standards include explicit lifecycle alignment, defined prompting modes, documented reasoning, structured adversarial review, preserved verification boundaries, clear ownership language. Without standards, drift becomes culture. With standards, acceleration becomes leverage. Failure patterns are not inevitable. They are predictable. Predictable risks can be governed. Governance begins with visibility. Visibility begins with articulation. Discipline erodes quietly. It must be protected intentionally. Execution accelerates. Comfort increases. Discipline must deepen accordingly. Section 14. What good looks like. A calibrated AI-integrated audit function. If failure patterns are subtle, what does disciplined integration actually look like? Good in an AI-enabled internal audit function is not defined by how often AI is used. It is defined by how deliberately it is governed. A calibrated function does not default to AI reflexively. It applies AI selectively, aligned with lifecycle stage and consequence weighting. Selectivity signals maturity. In planning, good looks like contextual framing preceding pattern leverage. Before generating risk lists or comparative analyses, the team articulates mandate, risk appetite, regulatory sensitivity, and recent exposure history. AI may then expand the horizon of possible risks, but it does not define them in isolation. The output is interrogated through contextual overlay. In fieldwork, good looks like disciplined separation between evidence and narrative. Evidence is gathered, validated, and absorbed before classification language is drafted. If AI assists in summarization, summaries are traced back to source material deliberately. Classification remains a human judgment, applied against documented criteria. I may structure articulation. It does not determine severity. In reporting, good looks like proportional tone alignment. Draft language is reviewed not only for clarity, but for calibration. Does the strength of language match the strength of evidence? Does the description reflect consequence weighting? Are qualifiers appropriate or excessive? Tone is treated as a risk variable, not an aesthetic one. In escalation, good looks like explicit reversibility assessment. Before communication, the team asks, is this decision reversible? If not, what friction has been applied? Have assumptions been documented? Has adversarial review occurred? Speed of articulation does not dictate timing of communication. Consequence dictates timing. Another indicator of good integration is ownership clarity. Final conclusions are stated with accountability. We conclude. We classify. We escalate. Language does not defer authority to tools. Tools assist. Professionals decide. Good also looks like transparent reasoning documentation. Reasoning is recorded alongside outcomes. Not only what was decided, but why. Which criteria were applied? Which assumptions were considered? Which trade-offs were weighed? If challenged later, the reasoning trail is reconstructible. This strengthens defensibility. It strengthens trust. It strengthens influence. Good integration also includes structured adversarial prompting. At defined inflection points, high severity classifications, reputationally sensitive matters, significant control breakdowns, adversarial review is mandatory. AI may be used to simulate dissenting perspectives, but dissent is not symbolic. It is documented. Counter-arguments are recorded. Assumptions are surfaced. This transforms skepticism from personality trait into structural discipline. Another hallmark of good integration is stopping discipline. When additional AI iterations no longer generate new insight, iteration stops. Attention shifts from refinement to decision. Decision shifts from language to ownership. Ownership shifts from output to accountability. This prevents productivity from masquerading as progress. Good integration also recognizes emotional dynamics. Acceleration increases expectation. Expectation increases pressure. Pressure increases temptation to close prematurely. A disciplined function names this dynamic explicitly. It trains professionals to distinguish clarity from certainty, speed from sufficiency, confidence from correctness, consensus from calibration. These distinctions are reinforced culturally. AI becomes an instrument embedded within that culture, not a driver of it. Another sign of good integration is evaluation alignment. If performance metrics reward only throughput, throughput will dominate. If performance metrics reward calibration consistency, early risk identification, and defensible reasoning, behavior aligns accordingly. Leadership must articulate that judgment, not volume, differentiates. The economic shift must be mirrored internally. Good integration also includes clear verification boundaries. AI outputs are treated as drafts, not evidence. Evidence tracing is mandatory before finalization. Severity criteria references are documented. Escalation thresholds are applied explicitly. Verification is scaled to consequence. High-impact matters receive heavier friction. Lower-impact matters receive proportionate review. Friction is intentional. Intentional friction signals seriousness. Another element of good is transparency with stakeholders. If AI is used to support drafting, that fact does not undermine credibility. What undermines credibility is inability to explain reasoning independently. Stakeholders care about defensibility, not tool usage. Good integration ensures that reasoning stands without the tool. Finally, good integration feels steady. Acceleration does not create volatility. Calibration remains consistent across engagements. Severity thresholds do not fluctuate with pressure. Escalation timing reflects criteria rather than convenience. Tone aligns with evidence consistently. When speed, risk, and ambiguity collide, steadiness differentiates. Steadiness is not slowness. It is proportion. It is visible discipline. It is confidence grounded in reasoning rather than in articulation. Execution accelerates. Judgment remains anchored. Good integration aligns the two, Section 15. Behavioral commitment, holding the line under acceleration. The final shift is not technical, it is behavioral. AI can be integrated into workflow. Prompting can be disciplined. Verification boundaries can be defined. Failure patterns can be understood. But none of those matter if behavior under pressure collapses. Acceleration changes tempo. Tempo influences psychology. When language is available instantly, silence feels inefficient. When structured analysis appears quickly, hesitation feels outdated. When stakeholders expect speed, delay feels risky. Under these conditions, the greatest risk is not misuse of AI. It is surrender of judgment to momentum. Momentum is persuasive. Momentum feels productive. Momentum creates visible progress. But momentum is indifferent to calibration. Calibration requires intention. Behavioral commitment means choosing calibration even when momentum invites closure. It means asking one more question when the room is ready to decide. It means pausing before escalation when articulation is available, but evidence strength is marginal. It means resisting the urge to soften language for relational comfort when exposure is material. It means resisting the urge to harden language for dramatic clarity when evidence is thin. Behavioral commitment is discipline under visibility. In an AI-accelerated world, judgment becomes more exposed. Visible judgment attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny can create defensiveness. Defensiveness can create overcorrection. Overcorrection can distort calibration. Behavioral steadiness requires confidence grounded in mandate, not in output. Mandate does not change with acceleration. Independence remains foundational. Skepticism remains expected. Proportionality remains essential. Accountability remains personal. AI does not absorb consequence. The professional does. Therefore, behavioral commitment requires explicit ownership. Ownership language should not feel performative, it should feel natural. We conclude based on these criteria. We classify this as significant because we are escalating now, because the clarity of these statements reinforces accountability. Accountability strengthens trust. Trust expands influence. Influence enables early involvement. Early involvement increases leverage. This is the compounding loop. Behavioral commitment also includes humility. AI expands capability. Expanded capability can create illusion of comprehensiveness. Illusion of comprehensiveness reduces curiosity. Curiosity protects calibration. If a structured output feels complete, humility asks, what might be missing? If a severity classification feels balanced, humility asks, what risk might we be underweighting? If a narrative feels persuasive, humility asks, would this withstand adversarial scrutiny? Humility is not doubt in mandate, it is vigilance against overconfidence. Another behavioral requirement is courage. Courage to introduce friction when speed is valued. Courage to defend classification when pressure suggests moderation. Courage to revisit decision when new evidence emerges. Courage to admit uncertainty explicitly when certainty cannot be justified. AI can articulate courage, it cannot enact it. Enactment is human. Behavioral commitment also includes restraint. Not every capability must be deployed. Not every analysis must be expanded. Not every scenario must be modeled. Restraint signals clarity of priority. Clarity of priority strengthens focus. Focus protects attention. Attention is scarce. Acceleration increases distraction. Distraction dilutes judgment. Behavioral discipline protects attention allocation deliberately. The professional who thrives in this environment will not be the one who masters every feature. It will be the one who masters internal pacing. Internal pacing means slowing down at high-consequence moments, accelerating when risk is low, pausing when evidence is incomplete, proceeding when criteria are satisfied. Internal pacing aligns tempo with consequence. AI increases external tempo. Judgment must govern internal tempo. The integration of AI into internal audit is not a technology story. It is a standards story. Standards must be explicit. Standards must be enforced. Standards must be modeled by leadership. If leadership prioritizes speed visibly over calibration, behavior will follow. If leadership rewards early risk identification and defensible reasoning, discipline will strengthen. Behavioral commitment must therefore be cultural, not individual. Cultural reinforcement includes celebrating well-calibrated escalation, even if uncomfortable, valuing documented reasoning over polished language, recognizing disciplined hesitation when consequence is high, encouraging adversarial questioning at inflection points. Culture determines whether AI amplifies rigor or erodes it. Technology does not decide culture. Leadership does. The final reality is simple. Execution accelerates, judgment concentrates, visibility increases. Accountability remains. Those who recognize this shift and adjust behavior accordingly will not merely adapt to AI. They will lead with it, without surrendering authority. And leadership, under acceleration, is not about speaking first. It is about deciding well.